The envelope was cream-colored. Thick paper, expensive paper. The kind people use when they want cruelty to look elegant. My father held it between 2 fingers while the wedding band played soft jazz behind him. Crystal glasses clinked somewhere across the ballroom. Somebody laughed near the champagne tower. And right in the center of my sister's wedding reception with 200 guests watching, and at least 3 cameras pointed at my face, he said words I don't think I'll ever forget. "This is from all of us." The room went quiet in that strange way wealthy rooms do. Not silence exactly. More like people inhaling and waiting for entertainment. My sister Emily stood beside him in a satin white gown worth more than my first military paycheck. Her lips curled slightly before she caught herself. She already thought she knew how this moment would end. I could see it in her eyes. She thought I would cry. She thought years of humiliation, rejection, and loneliness would finally break open in front of everyone she knew. Instead, I took the envelope calmly. I opened it. Read every word. Then I folded the letter once, twice, slid it into my purse, and smiled. That smile changed the entire night. Because nobody in that ballroom knew something I'd spent 6 years preparing for. Not even my father. Especially not my father. And as I looked into his suddenly uncertain eyes, I realized something almost funny. For the first time in my life, he was afraid of me. I arrived in Charleston 3 hours before the ceremony. Rain clouds hung low over the harbor, turning the sky silver gray above the water. The driver who picked me up from the airport kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror, probably because I was wearing my dress blues. People always stared at the uniform. Especially older people. Especially in the South. The gold buttons were polished. My ribbons perfectly aligned. My dark hair twisted into a regulation bun so tight it gave me a headache. I'd spent 21 years in the Army learning how to carry myself without showing discomfort. By now, composure felt more natural than breathing. But the second we pulled up to the hotel, that old familiar heaviness settled into my chest. The Ashcroft Hotel looked like something from an old movie. White columns, massive chandeliers, valets moving like synchronized dancers. Emily would love a place like this. My sister had spent her entire life believing appearances were reality. As I stepped out of the car, I heard someone say behind me, "That must be the military sister." Not Rebecca. Not daughter. Not family. Just the military sister. I smiled politely anyway. That was another thing the Army taught me. You learn how to survive rooms where nobody wants you there. Inside the ballroom smelled like roses and expensive perfume. The wedding planner hurried past carrying a clipboard while servers floated through the crowd with trays of champagne. Everything glittered, everything looked perfect. And none of it felt warm. I spotted my father near the bar almost immediately. Franklin Whitmore. 70 years old, silver hair, navy tuxedo, the same cold posture he'd carried since my mother died 15 years earlier. For a moment I thought maybe age had softened him. Then his eyes met mine. Nothing. No smile. No pride. No, you made it. Just a brief nod like I was another guest. I walked toward him anyway. Hi, Dad. You're late. I checked my watch automatically. The ceremony starts in 40 minutes. You still could have come earlier. Emily's been stressed. Of course she had. Emily was always stressed when attention shifted away from her for more than 8 seconds. I came as soon as my flight landed. His eyes moved over my uniform. You really wore that. There it was. Not even disguised. I kept my voice even. It's formal military protocol for events like this. You could have worn a normal dress. A normal dress. I almost laughed. 21 years serving this country, 2 overseas deployments, a Bronze Star, and somehow in his mind the embarrassing thing was the uniform. I think Mom would have liked it, I said quietly. That landed harder than I expected. His jaw tightened instantly. He still couldn't handle hearing about her. Before he could answer, Emily appeared beside us like a perfume commercial come to life. Blonde curls, diamond earrings, white satin wrapped around a body sculpted more by vanity than exercise. She air-kissed my cheek, carefully avoiding actual contact. Rebecca, she said brightly, you made it. Congratulations. Oh my God, everyone's been talking about your outfit. Outfit. Not uniform. Not service. Just outfit. I noticed the cameraman drifting nearby, pretending to film centerpieces while aiming directly at us. Emily noticed too. That was intentional. Everything with her was intentional. "You're sitting at table 14, she added casually. I blinked. 14. That was the only place left. Table 14 sat near the kitchen doors. Furthest possible table from family. I looked around the ballroom. My father's golf buddies sat closer to the head table than I did. Something cold slid quietly through my stomach. But I only nodded. Sounds good. Emily looked disappointed by my reaction. She'd expected visible hurt. Emily always preferred her cruelty witnessed. "Well," she said, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her dress, "try not to disappear before the cake this time." That one hit closer. 5 years earlier, I had left Thanksgiving dinner early after listening to Emily joke about soldiers having government-funded trauma. My father laughed harder than anyone. I never told them that 2 weeks before that dinner, I'd lost a 19-year-old private under my command overseas. Some things become too sacred to explain to careless people. "I'll stay," I said. Emily smiled triumphantly. Good. Then she walked away. As I watched her greet guests with practiced perfection memories, came back whether I wanted them or not. Emily at 16 getting a brand new Mustang while I worked double shifts at a diner to buy second-hand combat boots before enlistment. Emily crying because her college apartment was too small while I slept in desert tents that smelled like dust and diesel fuel. Emily calling me during my deployment not to ask if I was safe but to ask for money because Dad's business was struggling again. And every single time, I sent it. Money for tuition. Money for hospital bills. Money to stop foreclosure. I emptied savings accounts while eating military cafeteria food under fluorescent lights halfway across the world. Not once did they thank me without sounding inconvenienced by it. After Mom died, I became useful instead of loved. That realization took years to admit. A waiter passed carrying champagne. I took a glass and stepped toward the seating display near the ballroom entrance. Rebecca Whitman. Not Whitmore. Whitman. Wrong last name entirely. I stared at the card for several seconds. Then I laughed softly under my breath. At some point, humiliation becomes almost boring. A woman beside me shifted awkwardly. I'm sure it was just a typo. Of course, I said. But it wasn't. Across the room, Emily looked directly at me and smiled. The ceremony passed in a blur of organ music and fake tears. I stood when instructed, clapped when expected, smiled in photographs where nobody bothered placing me near the family. By the time the reception began, I already knew something was coming. You don't survive military intelligence work for years without learning how to recognize coordinated behavior. The whispers. The glances. My father disappearing repeatedly with Emily's husband. The way several relatives avoided eye contact completely. Something had been planned. I just didn't know exactly what. Not yet. Dinner arrived. Filet mignon, roasted potatoes, expensive wine I barely tasted. Emily floated from table to table performing happiness for the cameras, while her new husband Daniel looked increasingly overwhelmed. Poor man. He still thought he married into a normal family. Then halfway through dessert, my father stood. The microphone squealed softly in his hand. Before we continue, he announced, there's one more thing that needs to be addressed tonight. Every instinct inside me went still. He walked toward my table slowly, deliberately. And when he stopped beside me, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. This, he said evenly, is from all of us. My father held the envelope like a man presenting evidence in court. Not shaking, not angry, calm. That was the dangerous thing about him. Franklin Whitmore never raised his voice when he wanted to hurt someone. He believed cruelty worked best when delivered politely. Every conversation in the ballroom faded into a low hum around me. Forks stopped moving. Chairs shifted softly across marble floors. Even the jazz trio near the dance floor seemed to lose rhythm for a second. I looked up at him while he stood over my table. The cameras were ready. Of course they were. Emily had positioned them perfectly. One near the cake table, one beside the dance floor, one directly behind the head table with a clean angle toward me. This wasn't spontaneous humiliation. It was produced humiliation. Carefully staged. I took the envelope from his hand without speaking. The paper felt heavy. Inside, several sheets were folded together with unnatural precision. I noticed multiple signatures immediately before I even began reading. My father remained standing there while I unfolded the pages. He wanted an audience for this, wanted everyone to watch my face as the words landed. So I gave him exactly what he asked for. I read every line slowly. Rebecca. After years of disappointment, distance, hostility, and embarrassment brought upon this family through your choices and behavior, we have decided it is healthier for everyone to formally separate ourselves from you. You have made it clear that your loyalty belongs elsewhere. Therefore, from this point forward, you are no longer considered part of this family. Please do not attend future holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, or family gatherings. Do not contact us unless legally necessary. We release you from any further obligation to this family, and we ask the same in return. Signed, Franklin Whitmore, Emily Whitmore Carter. And beneath their names were others. My Aunt Linda, Uncle Robert, 2 cousins, even my mother's older sister. I stared at the signatures for several quiet seconds. Not because I was shocked, because suddenly everything made sense. The strange tension, the avoidance, the rehearsed smiles, Emily's excitement every time a camera drifted toward me. This was the performance, the final rejection, and the truly pathetic part. They thought this letter gave them power. I lifted my eyes slowly toward Emily across the ballroom. She stood frozen beside her husband, one manicured hand lightly touching her champagne glass. Waiting. Almost trembling with anticipation. She wanted tears. She wanted me to run out of the ballroom humiliated while guests whispered behind folded napkins about the unstable military daughter. I could practically hear the version of the story she'd tell afterward. Rebecca caused a scene. Rebecca embarrassed herself. Rebecca was always emotionally difficult. That had always been the family strategy. Hurt me first, then rewrite my reaction as the problem. But somewhere during my second deployment overseas, something inside me had changed permanently. Once you've informed parents their son isn't coming home, once you've watched 19-year-old soldiers bleed out asking for their mothers, once you've spent nights listening for mortar fire in complete darkness, people like Emily stop feeling intimidating. I finished reading, carefully folded the pages once, then again, and slipped them into my purse. The silence inside the ballroom deepened. My father frowned slightly, confused already. That almost made me smile. Then I looked directly at him and said calmly, "Thank you for finally putting it in writing." The expression on his face shifted almost invisibly. Just for a second. But I saw it. Uncertainty. Around us, guests exchanged awkward glances. Somebody coughed near the back wall. One of the servers stopped walking entirely. This wasn't unfolding the way they expected. Emily recovered first. She laughed softly into her microphone. "Well, I think honesty is important in families." Families. Interesting word choice from a woman who once mailed my deployment care package back unopened because it arrived during her birthday weekend. I stood slowly from my chair. The room tracked the movement immediately. "I agree," I said. Emily's smile tightened. My father crossed his arms. "Then maybe this gives everyone closure." Closure. That word nearly unlocked something ugly in me. Because closure implied mutual damage. Mutual failure. But there had never been anything mutual about what they did. After Mom died, my father stopped seeing me as a daughter. I became a resource, a backup account, a dependable obligation he could emotionally manipulate whenever necessary. And Emily learned from him early. I remembered being 23 years old in Afghanistan when Emily called crying because her credit card had been declined at a luxury spa resort in Arizona. "I'm literally stranded," she sobbed dramatically over satellite connection. I wired her $3,000 2 hours later. 3 weeks afterward, one of my soldiers lost both legs from an IED. Emily never asked about him. Never asked about me. Only whether I could help with another expense when I got home. I should have stopped then. But grief changes people. Especially daughters trying desperately to earn love from emotionally unavailable fathers. My father finally spoke again. "You've always blamed this family for your own decisions." There it was. The rewriting. He'd spent years telling relatives I abandoned the family for military glory, as if enlistment at 18 had been selfish instead of necessary. What he never mentioned was that our electricity had been shut off twice after Mom died. Or that he spent most insurance money renovating his office while I rationed groceries at home. Or that Emily somehow received a brand new convertible 6 months later. I looked around the ballroom slowly. Most guests wouldn't know any of that. They only saw a decorated army officer standing awkwardly at her sister's wedding after receiving a family rejection letter. And for a brief moment I almost pitied them. Because they had no idea what room they'd walked into tonight. Emily stepped closer now, still smiling for appearances. "Rebecca, maybe we should discuss this privately." "No," I said gently. "I think public honesty was your idea." A few guests lowered their eyes immediately. Others leaned forward. My father's face hardened. "Don't start something tonight." The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. Start something. As though he hadn't just handed his own daughter a formal exile notice during dessert. I reached for my champagne glass and took a slow sip. The bubbles burned pleasantly against my throat. Then I looked directly at Emily's husband for the first time all evening. Daniel looked pale. Confused. Uneasy in a way that told me one important thing immediately. He didn't know. Not all of it anyway. Interesting. Emily noticed where I was looking and quickly moved between us emotionally, if not physically. "Daniel, honey, it's fine. This is just family tension." Family tension. That phrase covered a multitude of sins in wealthy Southern families. Fraud. Manipulation. Theft. Years earlier, I might have stayed quiet to protect appearances. But appearances had stopped mattering to me the night I discovered my father had taken out loans under my Social Security number. I still remembered sitting inside my tiny apartment near Fort Bragg staring at collection notices I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed identity theft from a stranger. Then I found the signatures. My father's handwriting disguised badly beneath mine. The accounts traced directly to his business. And when I confronted him privately, he cried. Actually cried. Said he was desperate. Said Emily needed help. Said family sacrifices for family. Then he promised to fix everything. Instead, he told relatives I'd become unstable after deployment. Classic Franklin Whitmore. Destroy the daughter. Protect the image. I set my champagne glass down carefully. "You know," I said quietly, "there's something strangely comforting about this." Emily blinked. "What?" I touched the purse containing the letter. "This saves me time." Now my father looked genuinely uneasy. "Good." Because for 6 years, while they thought I was silently absorbing humiliation, I had been collecting everything. Bank statements, loan documents, insurance transfers, forged signatures, emails, hidden accounts. Every lie, every theft, every carefully buried secret. Military intelligence teaches patience in ways civilians rarely understand. You learn how to wait without revealing you're waiting. And suddenly standing in that ballroom filled with roses and crystal and fake smiles, I realized something almost beautiful. They truly believed tonight was the end of the story. I looked at my father, then at Emily, then at the cameras still recording. And finally I smiled again. "You really should have waited until after dessert." Nobody spoke after that. For a few long seconds the ballroom sat frozen beneath the warm chandelier light, while my words settled over the room like smoke. "You really should have waited until after dessert." My father stared at me carefully now, not angry anymore. Calculating. That expression used to terrify me when I was younger. It meant he was trying to determine how much control he still had over a situation. And for the first time in his life, he couldn't read me. Emily recovered faster than he did. She laughed lightly into the microphone, though I could hear strain underneath it now. "Oh my God," she said, glancing around at the guests. "Can we not do drama tonight? Rebecca always turns everything into some giant emotional production." A few nervous chuckles scattered across the ballroom. Not many. People were uncomfortable now. Good. I stepped away from my table slowly and picked up a champagne flute from a passing tray. The cold glass pressed against my fingertips while I walked toward the center of the room. Toward the microphones. Toward the cameras. Emily's smile flickered. "Rebecca, you wanted public honesty," I said calmly. "I think that's fair." Daniel shifted beside her. "Maybe we should." "No," Emily snapped too quickly. That caught his attention immediately. Interesting. I took the microphone gently from her hand. The ballroom speakers hummed softly. For a second I looked out across the crowd, men in tuxedos, women draped in pearls and silk, my relatives avoiding eye contact, friends of the family pretending not to stare. And suddenly I wasn't nervous anymore. I'd spoken at military funerals. I'd briefed generals. I'd stood in hospital corridors telling mothers their sons died bravely. This room was nothing. I wasn't planning to make a speech tonight, I began quietly. Honestly, I wasn't even sure I should come. The room stayed silent. My sister and I grew up about 6 miles from here in a little white house with a broken porch swing my mother refused to throw away. I smiled faintly at the memory. Mom used to say broken things deserved patience. That softened the room instantly. People leaned in now. Because unlike Emily's rehearsed perfection, grief sounds real when it comes from someone who's lived inside it. She loved this city, loved family dinners, loved holidays, loved traditions. I paused briefly. She also believed family protected each other. My father shifted where he stood. He knew where this was going now. Too late. After she died, things changed. Emily crossed her arms. Rebecca. No, it's okay, I said gently. We're being honest tonight. I turned slightly toward the guests again. When I joined the army at 18, my father told people I did it because I was rebellious. A small smile touched my mouth. The truth is, our power had been shut off twice and I couldn't afford college. Silence. Real silence now. Not performance silence. My father's jaw tightened visibly. I sent money home every month for years, I continued. For medical bills, mortgage payments, Emily's tuition. I glanced toward my sister. Her car payment once. Several heads turned toward Emily. Daniel looked at her sharply. She immediately shook her head. She's exaggerating. I kept receipts. That landed. The atmosphere changed physically after that. You could feel it. The subtle movement of people emotionally leaning away from my father and sister. Emily tried smiling again, but panic had begun creeping around the edges. You're seriously doing this at my wedding? I looked at her steadily. You handed me a family exile letter during dinner. A woman near the back muttered, Jesus Christ. Someone else whispered, did they really? Daniel slowly extended his hand toward Emily. What letter? Emily ignored him. That told me everything. I inhaled slowly before continuing. For a long time I thought maybe I deserved how this family treated me. My voice remained calm, but inside old wounds stirred painfully awake. That's the thing about emotional neglect. If it starts young enough, eventually you stop asking whether something is wrong with them. I looked down briefly at the champagne in my glass. You start asking what's wrong with you. Nobody moved. Even the hotel staff stood motionless near the walls now. Then I lifted my eyes toward my father. But 6 years ago something happened that changed everything. There it was. The shift. My father's face lost color instantly. Emily noticed, and for the first time all evening genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Rebecca, my father said carefully, this isn't necessary. Necessary. Funny word. Necessary was working 16-hour shifts overseas while wiring money home to people who mocked my career. Necessary was rebuilding your life after realizing your own father stole your identity. Necessary was spending years gathering proof because nobody would believe you otherwise. I reached into my purse. The movement alone caused visible tension across the ballroom. Then I removed a thin manila folder. Not thick. Not dramatic. Just enough. You see, I said softly, I discovered several loans had been opened under my social security number. Gasps rippled quietly through nearby tables. Daniel turned fully toward my father now. What? My father's voice hardened. That's enough. I ignored him. At first I assumed it was random fraud. I opened the folder calmly, until I found signatures connected to my father's business accounts. Emily stepped forward suddenly. This is insane. No, I said. Insane was realizing the family I spent years financially supporting had quietly destroyed my credit while telling relatives I was unstable. Daniel looked sick now. Actually sick. He stared between Emily and my father like he was watching strangers emerge from familiar skin. I confronted Dad privately, I continued. He told me he was desperate, promised he'd fix it. I looked directly at my father. You remember that conversation? His silence answered for him. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably at their tables. Because they remembered too. Not the fraud, but the rumors afterward. The stories about Rebecca struggling mentally after deployment. Rebecca becoming paranoid. Rebecca imagining things. Classic social execution. Discredit first, then isolate. I slowly removed several papers from the folder. Bank documents. Transfer records. Copies. I spent 6 years documenting everything I said. Emily's breathing had become shallow now. I could see it from across the room. Rebecca, stop. No? Simple word. Quiet word. But it landed harder than shouting ever could. I documented the insurance money from Mom's death. I lifted another page. The missing trust accounts. The forged signatures. The hidden transfers. Daniel whispered, Emily. She grabbed his arm instantly. She's lying. I looked at him carefully. She knew. Emily froze. And there it was. The moment. Not rage. Not drama. Collapse. Because Daniel believed me immediately. You could see it happen in his face. Every uncomfortable instinct he'd ignored all evening suddenly connected together. The cameras were still rolling. Guests were openly recording on their phones now. My father finally stepped toward me, voice low and dangerous. Put those papers away. I met his eyes steadily. Too late. Then I smiled slightly. The interesting thing I said is that before I arrived tonight, I mailed complete copies of everything to my attorney, the IRS and federal investigators. The ballroom exploded into whispers. Emily looked like she might faint. And my father. My father looked old for the first time in my life. I slipped the documents back into the folder carefully. Then I delivered the sentence I'd imagined for 6 straight years. That letter you handed me tonight, I said softly. My attorney received your fraud confession package this morning. The ballroom doors opened behind me, and 2 men in dark suits stepped inside. One of them scanned the room once before asking calmly, Mr. Franklin Whitmore. The entire ballroom seemed to inhale at once. My father didn't answer immediately. For the first time in my life, Franklin Whitmore looked cornered. The 2 men standing near the entrance weren't loud or dramatic. No flashing badges, no raised voices. Just dark suits, calm expressions, and the kind of quiet authority that makes people instinctively move out of the way. One of them repeated Mr. Whitmore. My father finally cleared his throat. I think there's been some misunderstanding. Of course he did. That was his specialty. Not lies exactly, he preferred softer words. Misunderstanding, confusion, accounting error, temporary oversight. He dressed betrayal in polite language until people questioned their own instincts. The older agent stepped forward slowly. We only need a private conversation, sir. Nobody in the ballroom believed that sentence meant anything good. Whispers spread across the room like wind through dry grass. Chairs shifted. Guests exchanged stunned looks over untouched dessert plates. Somewhere behind me, a woman quietly said, "Oh my God." Emily looked ready to come apart. "This is insane," she hissed at me through clenched teeth. "You planned this." I turned toward her calmly. "No, Emily, I prepared for it." There's a difference, a very important difference. Planning comes from anger. Preparation comes from survival. Daniel slowly stepped away from her. Not dramatically, just one step. But sometimes one step says more than screaming ever could. He looked at my father first, then at Emily, then back at me. "You knew about this?" he asked her quietly. Emily's face flushed deep red. "She's manipulating you." "That's not what I asked." The room became painfully still again. Emily grabbed his wrist. "Daniel, please don't do this here." But he pulled his hand back gently, not angry, worse, disillusioned. I recognized that expression because I'd seen it on my own face years earlier while staring at forged loan documents spread across my kitchen table. That moment when betrayal stops being suspicion and becomes fact. My father straightened his tuxedo jacket carefully, trying to reclaim authority through posture alone. "I'm not discussing family matters in public," he said coldly. One of the agents answered evenly. Then perhaps we should move somewhere private. Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. Southern wealthy families survive on appearances. Scandal is tolerable. Public scandal is social death. And tonight the entire illusion was cracking open under chandelier light. Emily suddenly turned toward me, voice rising. "You ruined my wedding." There it was. Not remorse, not denial, not concern about fraud. Only the wedding, only the spectacle. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No," I said quietly. "Your lies did." She stared at me like she wanted to slap me. But beneath the fury, I saw something else finally emerging. Fear, real fear, because Emily had spent her whole life believing consequences belonged to other people. Growing up beautiful teaches some women they can charm reality itself. My sister had floated through life smiling while everyone cleaned up behind her. Teachers, boyfriends, my father, me, especially me. But charm stops working when paperwork exists. One of my aunts suddenly stood from her table. "Franklin," she whispered sharply, "tell me this isn't true." My father's head snapped toward her. "Sit down, Linda." That answer alone told everyone enough. A murmur rolled through the ballroom. Uncle Robert avoided eye contact entirely now. One cousin quietly reached for her purse like she suddenly wanted to leave. Interesting, so not everybody knew the full story either. The older agent spoke again, polite but firm. "Sir, we have questions regarding several financial accounts connected to your business and personal filings." Daniel looked stunned. "Financial accounts," Emily turned toward him desperately. "Baby, listen to me. How much did you know?" She froze. Wrong pause. The wrong pause destroys people faster than words. I watched Daniel's expression change in real time. Every memory he had of her suddenly reorganizing itself inside his head. Every excuse. Every uncomfortable moment. Every strange conversation about money. He looked sick. And suddenly I almost pitied him. Almost. My father finally lost patience. "This is absurd," he snapped toward me. After everything I sacrificed for this family, I laughed softly before I could stop myself. The sound shocked the room. Because it wasn't bitter. It was tired. "You mean everything Mom sacrificed?" I corrected quietly. His face darkened instantly. That name still cut him open. "Good. You don't get to talk about your mother," he said. "Why?" My voice stayed calm. "Because she's the one person here who actually loved me." Emily flinched visibly. A few guests looked away. Truth makes people deeply uncomfortable when they've benefited from silence. My father stepped closer now, lowering his voice. "You think wearing medals makes you better than this family?" The old accusation. There it was again, as if service had always insulted him personally. I looked down briefly at the ribbons across my chest before meeting his eyes again. "No," I said softly. "But it taught me something you never understood." He crossed his arms. "What's that?" I held his gaze steadily. "That survival doesn't require permission." The words landed harder than I expected, because suddenly I wasn't talking about deployments anymore. I was talking about him, about surviving him, about surviving years of emotional starvation disguised as family loyalty. The younger agent quietly spoke into an earpiece near the ballroom entrance, while the older one remained focused on my father. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face slowly. "Emily, please tell me you didn't know." Tears filled her eyes instantly. Perfectly timed. Emily weaponized tears the way other people use lawyers. "I was trying to protect my family," she whispered. I almost admired the reflex. Even now she still believed herself the victim. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. Protect them from what she pointed at me. She's always hated us, because Dad loved me more. That sentence hung in the room like broken glass. Several guests visibly winced, because some truths sound ugly even when spoken honestly. And the terrible part. She believed it. My sister genuinely thought love was a competition she'd won. I looked at her quietly. "No, Emily," I said. "I hated what you became because of it." That finally broke something inside her. "You think you're so superior because you joined the military," she shouted. "You disappeared for years. You abandoned this family. Abandoned." Interesting word coming from people who mailed me a formal rejection letter during dessert. I took a slow breath. "When I was deployed in Kandahar," I said calmly, "I called home after one of my soldiers died." Emily's face tightened. "You told me not to sound depressing because you were hosting a pool party." Silence. Complete silence. Daniel looked at her like he no longer recognized the woman beside him. My father tried stepping in again. "That's enough." "No," another voice said suddenly. Everyone turned. It was Aunt Linda. She stood near her table gripping the back of her chair with trembling hands. Then she looked directly at me. We didn't know everything she said quietly. My father's expression turned murderous. "Linda." But she kept going. "He told us you'd become unstable after deployment." Her eyes filled with shame. "He said the letter would help create boundaries. Boundaries. God." The room shifted again, because now the guests understood the deeper ugliness beneath all of it. Not family conflict, manipulation. My father looked around desperately now, realizing control was slipping away from him piece by piece, and suddenly he looked old, not powerful, not intimidating, just old. The older agent stepped forward one final time. "Mr. Whitmore, we need you to come with us." Nobody moved. Then slowly, painfully slowly, my father looked at me. Hatred, fear, humiliation, all of it together. But underneath everything else, I saw one final emotion in his eyes for the very first time. Regret, not for what he'd done, for underestimating me. I picked up my purse calmly, and without another word I walked toward the ballroom exit. Halfway there, my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen. It was my attorney. I answered quietly. "This isn't a good time. You need to hear this," he said. I stopped walking. "What is it?" A brief pause. Then his voice lowered carefully. "There's something else we uncovered about your mother's will." I stepped outside into warm Charleston night air while chaos continued behind me inside the ballroom. The hotel doors closed softly at my back, muffling the noise into something distant and unreal. For a moment I just stood there beneath the glow of the entrance lights, breathing. Rain had started again. A soft coastal drizzle carrying the smell of salt water and wet pavement. My attorney Michael stayed quiet on the phone long enough to let me collect myself. Then he said carefully, "Rebecca, your mother created a secondary trust 6 months before she died." I frowned slightly. "That's impossible. Dad handled the estate." That's what he believed. Something in his tone made me step farther away from the entrance. Across the street, harbor lights shimmered against black water. Somewhere nearby, music drifted faintly from another wedding reception entirely untouched by scandal. "What kind of trust?" I asked. "A conditional inheritance." My heartbeat slowed strangely. Military training does that sometimes during high-stress moments. Your emotions pull inward instead of exploding outward. Michael continued, "Your mother hired a private attorney in Savannah shortly before her diagnosis became terminal. The trust remained sealed under specific release conditions." I leaned against a stone column near the valet stand. "What conditions?" Silence. Then, "You had to be formally separated from the Whitmore family." For several seconds I said nothing at all. Rain tapped softly against the pavement around me. Inside the ballroom I could still see blurred movement through tall windows, guests gathering in clusters, staff hurrying nervously, a security guard near the entrance pretending not to stare at me. "You're telling me I stopped trying to process it, the letter. Activated the release clause tonight." I closed my eyes. "Mom? Even after all these years, Mom?" A sharp ache moved through my chest so suddenly it almost stole my breath. Not because of the money. Because she knew. Somehow before she died, she knew exactly what would eventually happen to me in that family. Michael's voice softened. "Rebecca, I think your mother was trying to protect you." The tears came then. Quietly. Not dramatic. Just 2 tears slipping down my face before disappearing into the rain. I hadn't cried during the letter. Hadn't cried during the confrontation. Hadn't cried watching my father lose control in front of 200 guests. But this broke something open inside me. Because my mother had seen me clearly before anyone else did. Even before I understood myself. "What's in the trust?" I asked finally. "A lake house in northern Georgia, investment accounts, some family heirlooms." He paused. "And several personal letters addressed to you." Letters. God. I pressed trembling fingers against my mouth briefly. My mother's handwriting had always been elegant and slanted slightly left. I suddenly remembered sitting beside her at the kitchen table as a little girl while she wrote Christmas cards under yellow light. "You still there?" Michael asked gently. "Yeah." "There's more." "Of course there was. Your father attempted to challenge the trust years ago, but the attorney handling it refused disclosure because the conditions hadn't been met." A bitter laugh escaped me softly. "So tonight he accidentally handed me my inheritance." In legal terms, Michael exhaled quietly, yes. I looked back through the ballroom windows again. My father still inside. Still trying to preserve the collapsing remains of his image. And for the first time all evening, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Relief. Because revenge had never truly been about destroying them. It was about surviving them long enough to become free. I ended the call 20 minutes later and stood alone beneath the hotel awning while rain fell harder over Charleston. Eventually, the doors behind me opened again. I turned slightly. It was Daniel. His bow tie hung loose now, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years during dinner. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, "How long did you know?" "About the fraud." He nodded. 6 years. He stared toward the street, and you waited. I needed proof. Another long silence settled between us. Finally, he laughed once under his breath, not amusement, more disbelief. "She told me you were cruel." I looked at him carefully. That probably made things easier for her. His eyes reddened slightly. Was any of it real? I thought about answering carefully. But I was tired of careful. "She loves attention," I said honestly. "I don't know if she understands love beyond that." Daniel nodded slowly, like part of him already knew. Then he looked at me directly. "I'm sorry." Simple words. But sincere ones. Strangely, that mattered. Because accountability had been so rare in my family that hearing genuine remorse almost felt foreign. "You don't owe me an apology," I said. His jaw tightened. "Maybe not, but somebody should have apologized to you a long time ago." That nearly hurt more than the letter. He glanced back toward the ballroom entrance. They're still trying to control the narrative in there. Of course they were. Families like mine survive through narrative management. Protect appearances. Protect status. Protect the illusion at all costs. Daniel shook his head slowly. "I can't believe I almost married into this." Almost. Interesting choice of words. "You still can," I said quietly. He looked exhausted. "No," he answered after a pause. "I really can't." Then he walked away into the rain without another word. I never saw him again after that night. By morning, half the wedding guests had uploaded videos online. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Decorated Army officer publicly disowned during sister's wedding. Federal investigators arrive moments later. Family financial scandal exposed. Charleston society devoured it whole. Within 48 hours, Emily deleted every social media account she owned. Within 2 weeks, Daniel filed for annulment. 3 months later, my father's business offices closed permanently. Funny how quickly power disappears once fear stops protecting it. But none of that mattered as much as the lake house. I drove there alone 6 weeks later after final paperwork cleared. Northern Georgia in autumn looked like something painted by a patient god. Gold leaves drifting across winding roads, cold mountain air moving through pine trees, silence that felt clean instead of lonely. The house sat beside a quiet lake surrounded by woods. Small, white, peaceful. Nothing like the enormous polished emptiness my father always preferred. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and old books. And there, waiting on the kitchen table exactly where Michael promised they'd be, were the letters. 5 of them. All addressed in my mother's handwriting. My hands shook opening the first one. "Rebecca." If you are reading this, it means something finally happened that I prayed never would. I know your father, and I know how easily strong daughters become targets in weak families. Tears blurred the page instantly. I sat there for hours reading every word she left behind. Memories. Advice. Stories about my grandfather I'd never heard before. And one sentence I still think about almost every day. One day they will mistake your silence for weakness. Let them. I understood it completely now. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is preparation. Sometimes survival looks quiet until the moment it no longer has to. That evening I sat alone on the dock behind the lake house, watching sunset burn across the water in shades of orange and gold. No phone calls. No accusations. No performances. Just peace. Real peace. And for the first time since I was 18 years old, I realized something almost impossible. I no longer wanted my family to love me. Because freedom and longing cannot survive inside the same heart forever. The letter they handed me at that wedding was supposed to destroy me. Instead, it finally released me. And if you've ever been the person in a family who carried more pain than recognition, if you've ever spent years begging silently for love, you should have received freely. I hope you remember this. The people who underestimate your quiet strength are often the least prepared for the day you stop needing their approval. If this story stayed with you, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe family should never require someone to shrink themselves to be accepted, stay with us for more stories like this. There are so many journeys still waiting to be told,